Today at the West Wing Companion, we're facing up to trauma. It's certainly a fraught subject, and that seems to be part of the problem. We'll talk with Chief Investigator Pete Oliver about personal, professional trauma. How does a police officer, a DA investigator, a prosecutor deal with a job in which they have their hands and their minds inside of horrific crimes? How do you process seeing a domestic violence murder and then go home and have dinner with your family? How do you deal with society's darkest moments virtually every day? And how then do you process the everyday tragedies that all of us endure? Depression, divorces, deaths. And we'll talk with District Attorney Jeff Rosen about a trauma that is both deeply personal and deeply national. How does our country reconcile with its racist past? How does an office dedicated to justice confront its own biases that are right here, right now? At the height of a heated national debate about American racism, the DA traveled to the Deep South along with local clergy and civil rights activists. What did he find in Montgomery, Alabama? I'd like to welcome Chief Pete Oliver to our podcast to talk about trauma at its most intimate professional level. Thank you so much for being with us to talk about the subject. You're welcome. It's a delicate subject, but I think it's a vital one. Mm-hmm. For people who don't know, what pressures do cops have, do investigators have, that other professionals might not have to deal with in their jobs?
Well, we have similar stresses that other first responders have, in that you're exposed to a lot of things in human nature and life that are unpleasant. Some are grotesque, and they have, in many ways, a cumulative impact over the life of a career of a police officer or a deputy sheriff or any of the number of first responders like firefighters and paramedics. So the cumulative stressors are the things that we focus most importantly on today in our peer support program, and in fact, that's why we have it.
It's just simply the day-to-day dealing with other people's worst days. Is that what we're talking about here?
Pretty much, but we first responders are exposed to things similar in some ways maybe to what military personnel are exposed to. Mm-hmm. Very violent, grotesque scenes, the worst in human nature with emotion, mm-hmm. that first responders have to deal with and have to become problem solvers at the moment and then deal with the emotion that is inside of them at some future time. And frankly, a lot of first responders are very good at containing those emotions, right, pushing them off to the side and not dealing with them, and sometimes, in some instances, not in a healthy way.
Is that a culture? You were a police officer and a command staff officer for many, many years at a major metropolitan police department, San Jose. Is that a culture that's created by law enforcement? Or is that something that just sort of happens person by person, that's sort of a natural reaction to being in that job because you have to get such a difficult job done on the spot? Or is it both?
Frankly, I think it's just a human nature of the human beings. We all have our own coping mechanisms,
right?
And I think it's a function of that. I don't think there's any specific way that police officers or paramedics or firefighters are taught to deal with these things. I think we are kind of left up to our own coping mechanisms, sure. And as I mentioned before, some of them aren't healthy. And so the idea that there's some culture that promotes a certain way of dealing with things, I don't think is accurate to say. I think mm-hmm. it's really just the way human beings deal with tragedy mm-hmm. and stress.
When you look at yourself, how did you, over your career, deal with stresses? Did your coping mechanisms evolve over time?
I'm not sure I really recognized that I was coping in any particular way.
Yeah.
I, like a lot of people in our profession, use exercise as a way to just blow off steam, as we would call it.
Yeah.
We didn't really have a particular name for it.
Right.
So at the end of shift or before shift, I routinely had an exercise program. I ran, I worked out with weights, like many others do. And that seemed to make me feel better. It seemed to make me feel less stressed.
Yeah.
I don't know if the time when I was a young officer particularly that I was making a one-to-one connection between that as a way to cope with the stresses that I might see that day or that night or over the week.
Is that an issue in the sense that a lot of cops / investigators / first responders don't even know that they're suffering from the accumulative effect of dealing with these kind of horrific scenes?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think it's something, I mean, today's world compared to when I first was a young officer, I think there's way more discussion, much more training on it to young officers and first responders when they come on the job to give them some insight as to the things that we're talking about today. Unfortunately, that was not the way when I first came on, so we didn't really know what it was called. I think it's just like when we dealt with all our veterans coming back from the Iraq War, we started hearing PTSD really for the first time.
Right.
We didn't hear it after Vietnam, and certainly not in the Korean or World War II. That was just not something that was even talked about. So I think it's an evolution of thought and of bringing the professionals into our world to let us know the cumulative effects of stress, and now we've got names for it. PTSD being one,
Sure.
and crisis intervention stress management is another. And so those are things that are more freely spoken about with young men and women in this job today versus a few years back.
If one of your kids or grandchildren came to you and said, I want to be a police officer, and they were a rookie, and they got in and they were a rookie police officer, what advice would you have for them in terms of dealing with the stress of being in law enforcement?
A couple of things. First, I would say identify healthy ways to deal with stress, and I would encourage them to use exercise as one way. I think for two pieces. One, it's a very stressful job on your head, but it's also a stressful job on your body.
Sure.
And so it has huge cumulative effects on future injuries if you don't take care of your body when you're a young person and continue that regime throughout your career in law enforcement.
Right.
But also your mental health goes parallel to that, and I would advise them to surround themselves with good people. There's all kinds of people in our workplace. Some are good, some aren't so hot, and I think it's very important to surround yourself with good, caring, thoughtful, smart people that you feel comfortable talking about things in your life that are stressful. And it shouldn't be necessarily at a bar or in those kinds of circumstances, because that's not really, in the end of the day, helpful, because it has to be real. And so I think that would be the first two things I would talk to a young person about.
Yeah.
My wife always used to say to our kids, show me your friends, I'll show you your future.
Right.
I think it's not that much different in your career life. If you surround yourself with the right type of people, you will have a much healthier experience than if you surround yourself with unhealthy people.
Is vulnerability an important thing? A controlled vulnerability to the right people, right? But is vulnerability an important thing for a law enforcement officer to learn?
Well, I'd say yes, but it's a difficult thing to learn because
Sure.
of the walls that we typically build. And again, that gets back to my initial comments about we tend to silo our emotions. And so when you're siloing emotions, what you're really doing is building some kind of a wall. And so, yes, vulnerability is healthy, but it's difficult to achieve because of that siloing. And so it's kind of a dichotomy, really.
Right.
Because you kind of bounce back and forth, right?
Right.
You want to be vulnerable, but then I have to contain my emotions somehow to deal with the next call for service, which may be horrible. So it's simple to talk about, difficult to achieve.
Thank you for sharing with us.
You're welcome.
Welcome back to the West Wing Companion, sir.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Have you ever been to the Deep South before you went to Montgomery?
I had not. The farthest south I had ever been before this was Virginia, and not even the southern part of Virginia, basically the D.C. suburbs.
What were your impressions as you flew in?
Very lush landscape, a lot of green, a lot of open space, and not as crowded as Silicon Valley.
When you were walking around Montgomery or traveling around Montgomery, did it seem like you were in a distinctively different part of the country?
Yes, it seemed a lot different than Silicon Valley. The demographics of Montgomery are a lot different than here. It's predominantly white, maybe 20% African American, very few Latinos or Asians.
Did you have stereotypes about the South? Did you have like a sort of a picture in your mind, and did it reconcile with the picture in your mind?
You know, I don't know how much I thought about what the South looked like before I came, but I would say that, unfortunately, when I think of the South, I think of race relations and I think of slavery. That's probably not fair to Southerners who've grown up there, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Sure. And on that note, describe to me a powerful moment, a powerful image, a powerful moment where you were visiting some of the civil rights museums or walking around with some of the activists and having talks with some of the people that you met down there.
One of the parts of the exhibit that we went to at what's called the Legacy Museum of slavery and race relations in this country over the last few hundred years, one of the exhibits is someone reading letters that slaves wrote as their families were being sold and torn apart. So you would see a visual representation of a woman or a man talking about being housed at the site of the Legacy Museum, which a few hundred years ago was a slave warehouse where slaves were kept before they were auctioned off. And you would hear in their words the trauma of what was happening to them and their families, and it was quite, it was just awful. So that was very powerful. And then we later went to what's called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and they have an exhibit there which they call like a lynching exhibit of all of the people that they could find who'd been lynched not only in the South, but in places as far from the South as Minnesota, Delaware, Oklahoma, Iowa, and all of the people that were lynched there. And it's a very powerful exhibit.
Did that must have burst some of your preconceptions about slavery and about what had happened in the Reconstruction South?
Yeah, I think that while you learn about slavery and racism in textbooks, when you're in grade school and high school, and maybe you take some college classes about it, one of the things that I took away from this trip that I hadn't quite thought of before is I was familiar generally with the fact that African Americans at some point in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century left the South in large numbers and went to the North and the Midwest. So I sort of knew that intellectually, like, oh, that's what happened. And if you'd asked me before I went on this trip, well, why do I think African Americans left the South? I probably would have said, well, racism, better economic opportunities.
Sure.
But I think in addition to that, what I had never thought of is all of these lynchings that were happening in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. I mean, thousands and thousands of African Americans lynched, that essentially the African Americans fleeing the South, they were like refugees, like they were fleeing a
Right.
war zone to go to a place where they wouldn't be killed. So I had never thought of it in those terms before, thinking of that migration as sort of like refugees.
To a lot of people, I think when they hear about slavery or hear about that type of violent racism, it seems almost like a distant historical lesson, almost something that's just so removed from them and their daily lives that they really can't relate. I mean, particularly among the white population in America. Is racism here? I'm not talking at a subtle level. Is that kind of virulent racism still here in America, in your opinion?
Well, one of the things that this museum and trip to Montgomery brought forth is that explicit, vile, overt racism didn't end in the Civil War. It didn't end in Reconstruction. It didn't end in the Jim Crow era, but certainly continued until the last few decades. And the legacy of that is something that I grapple with as district attorney in terms of trying to get communities that have been historically distrustful of law enforcement to trust law enforcement. And I would say historically distrustful of law enforcement for good reason, because a lot of the racism and discrimination was either perpetrated by law enforcement officers, aided and abetted by them, or at least allowed to happen by those officers. So I think that's an unfortunate legacy that we're still grappling with today.
You not only work within the justice system, but you're responsible in many ways for the justice system here in Santa Clara County. I think you would agree that there are elements of potential implicit bias in the system. You've studied disproportionality in the way we prosecute crimes and in the way people are incarcerated. What can we do?
Well, one thing I've learned in trying to grapple with the disproportionate effects that we have in the criminal justice system on people that are African American and Latino is the disproportionalities that are reflected in the criminal justice system are very deeply ingrained in all other aspects of our society, whether it's where people live, where they go to school, what kinds of jobs they have. And so what I've come to realize is that in trying to reduce the negative effects that the criminal justice system has on, let's say, African American and Latino communities, the way to accomplish that is by lightening overall some of what the criminal justice system does. In other words, African Americans and Latinos are disproportionately represented in low-level drug crimes, drug possession crimes. Mm-hmm. So if we now have a policy, as we do in our office, to not prosecute low-level drug possession with some exceptions, that's something that will disproportionately benefit African American and Latino communities. So another example is our juvenile hall, when I came into office 8 years ago, had about 350 kids in it. 80% were Latino. Now the juvenile hall has 120 kids in it. That's good. 80% of those kids are Latino. So that the percentages are very tough to change, but the overall numbers are reduced. So the number of Latinos and African Americans in juvenile hall is dramatically lower than when it was when I took office, but that disproportionality still exists.
What did you bring back with you from Montgomery, Alabama?
A deep humility about what we're trying to accomplish in the DA's office of vigorously pursuing justice in a way that's fair and treats everyone equally and with respect, and a stronger appreciation for how slavery, racism, Jim Crow, segregation, how those policies and practices that we had for hundreds of years in this country continue to have a profound effect on how we try to promote public safety today.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.